Dr. Goodwin, members, if you agree, before our 1 o'clock recess, I think we ought to go to Dr. Goodwin's report, which is file item number 9 in our agenda. Dr. Goodwin.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Is the microphone on?
No. Right. It is on.
Perfect. Okay, well, I have 3 agenda items today. First, to give you an update on one of the science reviews which we've just completed. I then wanted to mention briefly about the State Fellows Program, and then probably most importantly is to give you an update where we are on the science planning effort. So first of all, I thought you would have an interest in the independent review that's just been completed of the 2012 long-term operations opinions that was conducted for the National Marine Fisheries Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And of course, these reviews are by nature critical. And what we ask these panels to do is several things. First of all, to make sure that the best available science is actually being implemented. Secondly, is the scientific evidence or the science evidence, does that support the objectives of what's actually being conducted? And also, are there any new ideas when you bring in these experts from around the country and sometimes overseas? They're there because they have a certain expertise, they're truly on the cutting edge. As part of this process, we also want to see that this isn't just a review panel, but it's part of a process. And often these external panels, you obviously are not experts in some of the local details. So as part of the process, the agencies that these reviews are conducted for then digest the outcomes and then provide a response to say how they plan to react to those various recommendations of the independent panel. So what I'd like to do now is just give you the highlights of what came out of that process, and then maybe give us a more detailed feedback in a few weeks when we see how effective the review was, how some of those comments were being implemented. And so this was different to the previous year's review, where the National Marine Fisheries Service suggested that rather than covering all of the RPAs, the reasonable and prudent actions associated with the long-term operations opinions, what you tend to get to, if you look at all of those actions, is a fairly shallow review. And they suggested it would be a lot more constructive, a lot more useful to the process to pick 2 of the really key actions and allow the panel to delve into those issues in a lot more depth. And so they selected the Clear Creek RPA and then the Spring 2012 Delta operations. So both of these actions are for salmon and steelhead primarily. Clear Creek is actually very interesting. I hadn't realized until the review panel came in just how critical Clear Creek is in terms of the long-term viability of salmon populations. It's an incredibly productive system. And it's also, I think, of interest to you and the science program that Clear Creek is being managed through adaptive management, and they have many years' experience with adaptive management, so there's some lessons, I think, that we can pick up to see how the agencies have worked together, how the adaptive management process has actually worked in a fairly complex system. For the Spring 2012 Delta operations, this was the joint stipulation agreement that they wanted examined that is an alternative to what is actually appears in the RPA, and the action is written there in my report. So what that actually is looking at Delta export restrictions based on the San Joaquin inflows, so a huge issue. And so it was the first time it was conducted, so it was somewhat experimental. Also in 2012, it was classified as a dry year, and for a long time it looked as though it was going to be a critical year. So it was a stressful year and a great time to be out monitoring. The panel made some very specific recommendations. In fact, there's 54 pages of it. So this panel really got into it, and I think it also shows the value of you can bring in a panel, they do a one-year review, and that's it. This is the second time this panel, or the majority of them, had come back. So they were very familiar with what's going on. They had an in-depth knowledge. And because they were focusing just on these two topics where they actually had a lot of expertise, there's a lot of very substantive recommendations. So I'll just pick a few of the high points here that I think, primarily because it has a lot of relevance to what we're thinking about in the science plan. The first, I think, major point was, and this came out in the 2011 report, they were warning that sometimes you can put physical targets into an RPA, but it's not routinely achievable to achieve those targets. And so one of their comments was, when you break down the years into just 3 classifications, things are actually more complicated than that. Your antecedent conditions, what happens in that given year. And related to that, they really highlighted something which I think Mr. Fiorini was getting to in the town hall meeting, that we really need to be focusing on these linkages between the physical targets which you might put out there and what is actually the biological and the ecological responses. So they have a lot to say about that. The second part that was very interesting, again linked to the bigger picture of science, that in 2011 there was a workshop that looked at the salmon life cycle models, and it was very useful because it highlighted what we know well, what we don't know, particularly if you're looking at the full life cycle model and then how you scale that up to population viability. And there's a lot of experts on the panel, but I was very intrigued to see Steve Lindley come in from the National Marine Fisheries Service and describe their approach to how they're building the next generation of life cycle models. And he was focusing primarily on going beyond what they call PTM, particle tracking modeling. I'll talk about that in a moment. But I was very intrigued the way he was looking out across the full spectrum of models that go into the salmon life cycle model, and how he was pulling in various bits and pieces to build this much more holistic model. So I think seeing how NIMPs move ahead with that in the coming months, there'll be a lot to learn. So with a particle tracking model, this is very interesting, as you've seen, and one of the things that the State Water Resources Control Board do, or did recently in their panel, I think Mr. Fiorini was there, where they were talking about hydrodynamics 101, and you can actually see how particles move around the delta. So how does this water particle move from A to B? How quickly does it get there? What sort of patterns does it take in this very complex flow system? Traditionally, we've used that as a surrogate for how these very small fish move around. Now the science community are a lot more sophisticated, and we realize that the fish behavior is much more complicated. And so what will happen with these outgoing smolts is that if you just model it as a particle moving with the average flow, and you're in a tidal reach, that particle would move backwards and forwards, and it can take 30, 35, 40 days, depending on which path it takes to move through the delta. The fish behavior is actually, some people refer to it as tidal surfing. So if the fish is wanting to move out, that small fish will move up into the current where the velocities are higher, and it will move out towards the ocean. As soon as the tide turns, the fish will either move vertically over the water column or move to the edge where the velocities are less. And so as it moves down, its backward trajectory on the tidal flow may be a lot less. And so both the panel and Steve Lindley was just describing why we need to add this additional level of complexity, and both, as you'll see in the report, and what Dr. Lindley was talking about, there's some very innovative ways of putting that together. So, as I say, I think it was a very, very thorough report, and if this is something that interests you, I think we should come back and then just show how the role of science and independent review actually feeds back into the process to advance knowledge discovery in the most rapid way possible. So are there any questions or thoughts on that? I should have said, this is the co-equal goals.
Okay.
Yeah. Both of these projects water reliability versus ecology. The California Sea Grant Fellows program, this is a wonderful program. It gives an opportunity for young scientists who have just graduated or still at school to take a year out and to work directly with a state or federal agency on science issues. So it's an opportunity for them to engage at the policy level. So it's a wonderful way of training young people for the future. And we have 2 fellows that decided to come and work with the science program. Emily Mortazavi will be coming to work primarily with the Independent Science Board, and Katie Morris will be coming to work with the science program. We'll give them a range of opportunities, what they want to work on, so the year is very valuable for them. But we certainly hope that Katie may well have an interest in working on elements of the science plan.
You weren't able to steal those 2 students for the science plan entirely?
They could. Boy, we need the help there, but you will see.
Okay.
Yeah, certainly, one of the things Dr. Norgard didn't mention was just, of course, the Independent Science Board is just fascinated in where we're going with that. So that may well be where she ends up. So now I'd like to talk about where we are with the science plan itself. And, first of all, I would probably like to thank Mr. Johnson for his comments last time, because...
You mean the Monastery of Science?
Yes. If there's any scientist in California who doesn't know there's now a science plan underway, they before your last meeting, they certainly do now. I don't know, but your comments went viral. And I really like
it was that photograph that really encapsulated the whole thing.
So yeah, your comments when you were articulating different models, it was picked up by Maven, and there was a lot of humor going around on the web. I don't know if you saw some of that. It was very well done. So I think they're the power of social media to you promote science. But on a more serious note, of course, since that meeting, there's really been a lot of discussion, because the dialogue which we had, I think, captivated a lot of folks' attention. So you really, during the last month and right through the end of this year, we've been through a series of meetings at many, many different levels. And I think, as we've discussed before, that there's so many initiatives going on, not just agency activities, but also collaborative activities which are currently underway or in the formative process, that captures a little about what the Stewardship Council is about. And we certainly need to include, to enhance, you to support many of these activities. But your role, of course, is looking way beyond that. It's not just a single mission, a single agency mission. You have this comprehensive overview look at things. So I think with Mr. Fiorina's comments about you're going to be asked about one action, and immediately how's this connected to all the other decisions that you're going to be faced with making? How do we pull these various things together? And so that's what we've been very active doing. I've got a brief summary. This is very much a work in progress, and what we'll continue doing every meeting is giving you a brief update. These things, I'm sorry, aren't posted ahead of time because much of it is so recent. So if you could pass those around. The PowerPoint presentation will be online for those in the audience or for those of you who are listening in. And you had asked us several things, but I'd like to just step back and what's the science plan about? So the science plan is, of course, to coordinate science and the focus of science across various agencies to support both the adaptive management of the ecosystem and the water management decisions in the Delta. So this is exactly as it's stated in the final Delta plan right now. And all of this is geared towards being able to achieve the co-equal goals. Back in November, you asked us to look at several things in the last few weeks. The first is to define the problems which need to be resolved by the Delta Science Plan, and then to come up with some preliminary ideas of how they might be solved. So this is very preliminary thinking where we're getting to the solutions, because we have to tie into so many of these other activities that are going on. The second issue, which is really big, and this gets back to the monastery, is to describe how science works and interfaces with policy to implement all the various steps of adaptive management. And so we've gone back to the figure that is in the draft Delta plan, and we filled in the boxes as Mr. Fiorini had requested us to do. And we also need to illustrate a new path forward to give you some ideas on how you feel all of this should be structured. And then at the end of each of these presentations, we'll just give you the next steps, so what you can expect to see in the next meeting. So this is just a brief summary of the broad problems which we're trying to address. The issue is that there's multiple entities currently conducting science to address very specific issues. That can be the issue that's specific to a particular agency issue, or a particular problem. And so, because most of the resources and efforts are focused on these single efforts, it's very difficult to develop this broad, best available science that may pick up adaptive management across all of the aspects of what's going on in this very complex system. So that's the first issue. The second is that the concern, I think, right across science, right across all of the interests, is that too many of these management decisions are currently being made in courtrooms. So how much of this can we separate through the science plan to build the body of knowledge upon which management actions can be based? So let's move the science discussion out of the courtrooms to the extent possible. So the solution to those two issues are the science plan, which is a framework for conducting science that does essentially three things. Organize and integrates the Delta science activities to provide the best available science that focuses on the priority management issues, but what the community of science can stand behind. Secondly, it will provide approaches for communicating that science, not just when it's done, but throughout the process, to support the various decision-making that's going on. And thirdly, to do this is to build on the current ad hoc collaborative efforts that go on across the Delta. How can we enhance, how can we support those researchers to cluster around many of these big issues or the big challenges that we spoke about last time? And of course, we discussed the whole concept of one Delta and one science, how we actually build that. And we're very cognizant of, I think, Mr. Fiorini and Mr. Johnson's comments about the difficulty of just rounding up the scientists and expecting something to pop out. So we've been spending a lot of thought about how you actually coordinate that in a structured way. This is just a list of the Delta Science Plan. This is taken directly out of the final draft of the Delta Plan GR1. So this is just to refresh your memory. This is also on the one-page flyer which we've had out since the science conference to explain what we're about.
Peter, can I just make a suggestion on this? I've been thinking about how to approach the subject of the science plan organizationally. And more I'm drawn to the notion that you have to answer substantially different questions on organizational issues from research issues. You've got two things here in particular, the institutional and organizational structures for science and independent science review, that seems to me to lead to an area where project proponents and critics would actually both like to know something in advance. So, for example, if a significant physical project, ecosystem or water reliability, is going to be done in the Delta, does your judgment of what science requires suggest that significant projects must include in the development phase independent scientific review of their plans not yet formally adopted? Because I think an applicant, although they grump about the whole thing, would want to know things like, well, what are you asking me to do? I mean, don't tell me to do good science and use best available science. Tell me what it is. How is it measured? And we kind of say, well, you finish up and we'll tell you where you failed. I don't mind the we'll tell you where you failed routine, but I think we owe a duty to project applicants to tell them, yes, during your development stage, you should incorporate independent scientific peer panels. And oh, by the way, here's who should verify the membership on those peer panels. I'm agnostic on whether it is an overview peer panel or discrete elements, but it's hard for me to imagine, I'm just making this up, a project that would cost more than $200 million that would not be served well by being required to involve independent peer review in the development stages. And in some sense, I look back on the National Research Council's evaluation of BDCP, their three-part series over the last 2 years. And the first one was pretty clear. It says, it's all gummed up. You haven't produced your reports. You don't know what you're talking about. You haven't gotten your priorities. Get going. Well, everybody knew that was true, but they said it in a forceful manner. Their second report says, you're working harder, but it's still not good enough. Where are the answers? Everybody knew that's true. And then their third was, guys, water's a scarce commodity, but we're not running out in California. You simply have choices to make them. Now, I thought that was, in terms of a large overview, pretty effective. I think the science plan has to lay out some of the institutional requirements in advance for project applications. And separately, based on your earlier discussion of new information that's coming in, I think you've got to have a science plan that takes the risk associated with informing the world, project proponents, project opponents, that X is relevant. So you've talked about the fact of new evidence on fish species, their ability to adapt and change and move and modify based on climate, temperature, all of the other stuff that goes on. It's almost like an advisory. Yes, it will change over time. Yes, it's subject to variations. No, it's not universally applicable. But a science plan ought to formalize that process so that a project applicant or an opponent can look somewhere and say, well, here's the best things we know today on sea level rise, climate change, temperature adjustment, the concept of an atmospheric river, for example, is another example. Now, I know in the science world, since nothing's ever really finished and perfectly designed, the notion of declaring what you know in a definitive sense is kind of alien to the scientific culture. But for a science plan to be utilized by folks on the ground, they have to know when they have to do something, what should be done, and what factors are out there. And that's the part of this that I think you're going to have the greatest trouble with. But I think it's the part that most of the people who are consumers, not of science, but of how this applies to ecosystem and to water reliability, will be interested in knowing.
Actually, that's a great point. Well, actually, I think you made two very discrete points, and I think we agree totally with you. And I think you'll actually hear this afternoon in the example project, the value of that peer review, certainly as projects come forward. So any project above a certain level.
This is on the South Yolo proposal.
Right, and how you engage a broader community. The second point about having that body of knowledge that you can use and have assurance that it isn't going to get shot down, absolutely, that factors into our thinking as well.
Well, you can't give absolute assurances. You can give you're better positioned to avoid litigation if you do the following things.
Right. I think, for example, if one of the things that could be out there is a hydrodynamic model that is tested and approved by peer review, that's certainly and then a consultant comes in, uses that model, it's less likely to challenge because that's the one that has the backing. And it certainly also gets, the point you made, I think, gets exactly to what Mr. Fiorini was saying last time. Bring in the science right at the beginning. And you'll see that's now included as part of the adaptive management wheel. But both of those points are very good. Within this, how do you actually do the science plan? There's really three areas of this. The infrastructure, how do you exchange data? How do you build the common models? What's the new technologies coming out? Are we on the cutting edge of using the best technologies? Secondly, there's the people, how you interact, how you build this community of science. And then there's what you just spoke about, Mr. Chairman, the governance and the framework. And so going back to the big issues which we stepped through last time. So these are really some of the problems, the policymakers' grand challenges. So currently, from I think what we're hearing from all sides is that the policymakers, the folks who are actually out there making the decision, are not confident that the current research that is underway is really focused on the high priority issues. There's great science going on there, but is it really geared towards giving the answers in a reasonable time frame? Secondly, as we heard from Dr. Klern at the town hall meeting, is that often scientists are not aware of these high priority issues, and how can we develop a dialogue to bring these two groups together? And so we've received a lot of information, we've got some great ideas about this, but somehow we need to perhaps road test or come up with some innovative interfaces between the policymakers and the science communities to address these issues. How do we focus and enhance collaborative research across all of the various agencies? How do we anticipate the future challenges in a way that makes sense? And I think most importantly, as we heard from you last time, is that how do we develop this system understanding so that if you're making a decision for action A in this part of the delta, what are the implications elsewhere? Is it going to be a cumulative benefit, or will those two benefits nullify one another? So I won't go into all of the ideas right now. We're still distilling some of what we're hearing, and as well as our own ideas. The problem associated with, so that's the big questions. Some of the problems associated with the institutional and organizational structure. As I mentioned before, the multiple entities in the Delta, disparate science efforts leading to insufficient sharing of information, overlapping efforts, and in some cases conflicting science. And all of these are likely to be impediments to truly achieving the co-equal goals. I'd like to stress the value of the science conference again. The number of connections that were made in the corridor there. People using similar technologies for monitoring fish that weren't aware of one another. Here's a university over here, here's an agency here. So how can we enhance that? And so what we're developing is a shared plan and vision that will allow all of these independent science entities to function, to share science that will inform policy, to achieve the co-equal goals. And this is really the vision of the One Delta, One Science. The third element of this is the shared computer models. And currently there's many models. Entity A develops a model. There's a certain lack of trust in developing it because where the funding came from, it doesn't matter which side you're on. So then somebody else on the other side develops a similar model, different algorithms, you're likely to get different results. So this was discussed at length in the recent State Water Resources Control Board hearings, and that's certainly a group we're interacting very closely with now on these next steps. Often these models, it's not clear. The assumptions that go into the models, in some cases the algorithms aren't clear. It's very difficult for independent groups or other people to replicate those same conclusions. And so the solution to this, I think, is definitely one of the more doable activities. There's examples in other branches of science where this has been done very effectively. It needs to work for consultants. It needs to work for agencies. And so I won't spend a lot of time talking about this, but I would say that the invited panel at the final State Water Resource Control Board hearing started out, and the opening slide was models are for developing insights. It's not for the numbers. The value of models is that they become the repository of the best available information about that particular process. You put it into a model, you can start then pounding on uncertainty, sensitivity of the models, and begin to quantify what we really know and what we don't know about the system. So I won't spend a lot of time on this, but there's some very good ideas that have come out of the follow-up from the town hall meeting and some of the recent discussions on how you actually put that together. So that's just a summary. When we come back in January, we'll have a lot of this fleshed out for you. But that was hitting the problems and how we're going to approach some of these issues.
I should probably just tell you that we just got a note on Maven's notebook. Chapter 7 of the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, the revised governance chapter, has just been released for public view. It's posted on their website. Nobody's had much of a chance to look at it other than the folks who developed it, but it closes with a reference as to the purpose of this chapter, closes with a reference to a responsive plan implementation guided by new information and scientific understanding, emphasizing once again this discussion is directly relevant to that.
Right.
Yeah. And then they've got a meeting on I think it's the 18th of December to have a first review of this chapter.
Great, that's very timely. The second task you posed for us in November was to show how science works throughout all steps of adaptive management. And this gets to Mr. Fiorini's comment that you need the science engaged right at the start. So you obviously can't read all of this text. It is there in front of you. But essentially, Lindsay, who has really been leading this adaptive management and how it might be implemented with the science program, you added 3 boxes there, so we now have science involved in every step. So as you'll see there, right at the first step, where we're looking at basically establishing the goals and objectives, providing that scientific evidence for identifying and defining the problem that you're trying to solve. And then you're moving into the goals and objectives, looking at communicating any limitations and opportunities and what the scientific chance of success of achieving those goals and objectives. And then in the 9th step of your adaptive management wheel, there's using science to inform the management and policy decision makers about the viable alternatives. So help using the science to make decisions between different alternatives to ensure that those goals and objectives are met. And all of this will be expounded on, of course, a lot more. So the third thing you'd asked us to do is to consider a path forward. So I come back to the slide that generated a lot of the discussion last time, that science we know is a team sport. There's been this rapid transformation in the past decade. The big discoveries are occurring between multi-authored papers, massive teams, sometimes numbering hundreds. So science is a team sport, we know that, and policy is also a team sport. There's no one entity making a decision on a policy. So what should that interface look like between the science and policy? And we certainly don't have any of the magic answers yet. But we did explore what that interface might look like and what the roles of those different boxes might be. So there's the science community that collaboratively develop, synthesize, and communicate the best available science. So this is the idea of building a single knowledge base. Scientists will never agree on everything, but I think that what we can do is decide what is known, what the uncertainties are, and where the priorities are for reducing those uncertainties. On the other side, from the policy, there's the responsibility of being able to communicate what these grand challenges are. And then, of course, at the policy level, you have to actually make the management decisions, or whichever agency is responsible for that. And so what should that relationship be between science and policy? And it isn't something which is done right at the end. You don't do the science and then just come out with a single recommendation. So a lot of our internal discussion has been, and we'll come back to you with some more ideas. There's several models which have been proposed. But what should that interface look like? In the BDCP early stages of adaptive management, they had that really nice report that came out making suggestions about adaptive management. And I expect this probably originated with Denise Reed or Tom Dunn, but the concept of a polymath, the 18th century European scientist she was all seeing and all doing, to act in that role. I think that's probably too much in this day of highly complex science to expect an individual to do that, but how do you get these very influential scientists that really understand the Delta well to interface with the people who are making the decisions? So any thoughts that you have on that, if we have time to discuss now, or if you've had a chance to reflect, we would certainly like to include that in the alternatives we'll put out for your consideration next time. And then this is really the final point, that infrastructure should coordinate and integrate the science efforts. It should communicate the grand challenges. So this is the interface, what the policymakers need at the top end. How do you rally the science community around interim results and long-term science that will anticipate what these questions might be in the future? Communication, of course, is a large part, and then how that interfaces with adaptive management. So that's where we sit right now. We've certainly generated a lot of information and ideas from many different sources. We welcome your input, either now or in the coming 2 to 3 weeks. We're also going to take the feedbacks which we receive from the town hall survey, the online responses, and the consultation that we've been having with the various agencies and interagency efforts. And we'd like to come back to you in January with a draft outline of what all of this might look like and what we're doing to fill in the gaps to that outline. So I'm going to stop there and see what questions, thoughts?
Hank?
Very well done. Beautifully organized. Nicely done. It's a little bit intangible for me,
Sure.
but I'm more of a hands touchy-feely guy.
You're a what?
I like
A
to feel
touchy-feely guy?
things. Yeah.
Boy, that's close to the last thing I ever would have come up with.
2 lists would be good. One list would have those contentious scientific issues where there isn't any agreement at all, and that would be important. And another list would be those areas which are most important, where we don't have complete science on, or complete direction from the scientific community to take.
Right. And then to take that to the next step, that's where you begin to coordinate and target
Exactly.
research. Yeah, that's a good point.
Randy? Okay, so in January, we're going to have a first fully fleshed out draft plan with content.
You're going to see a detailed outline with how we're going to fill that in, I think. So it'll be our proposal of what the science plan should look like, what the gaps are, what we're doing to fill that, what we're doing to reach out to many of these other programs which are currently underway.
So if I were to say to you, I would like to see answers that the proponents of the McCormick-Williamson ecosystem development should meet in order to meet the test of best available science and adaptive management, you'll give me a list of the 7 things they must do. And ditto for, some water project operation, right?
Well,
that expectation is a reflection of people who are nervous about what you're going to say, but at least want to be able to understand and apply in a systematic fashion some practical measures and steps that would, in good faith, be consistent with what you're saying. So it can't just be a theoretical discussion. It has to suggest organizational structure, which you've mentioned. It's got to suggest timelines. You've mentioned independent science. You have to say what that means. Who gets to determine it? I mean, all those things are part of what public policy people want out of science. I know it's uncomfortable for science, but that's the kind of stuff we want, because the people who come here say, what in the hell are you asking us to do?
So I think in response to that, there's 2 things. When you're looking at the restoration of a single project, there's actually 2 or 3 examples going on right now. In fact, the first example you gave, there's a meeting next week. You basically to explore some of these issues. So I think we can learn from these efforts and the ones which are already underway to see what is going to work. What's worked, how do you move folks together? So that's specifically for restoration. On some of these other much more intangible issues, if you like, the flow versus your habitat, how the system responds over time. How do you pull all of the information together to understand the system-wide response of all of this? That's going to be, it's a science question, and how we organize science to get to that point is a little more complex.
Would it be possible, Chris, to come up with an example of a restoration project, the sort of information you need, and then the follow-up measurements that you would perform from the adaptive management standpoint? Try to simplify it as much as possible.
I think for a specific restoration, absolutely, and that's one of the things we can perhaps pose of the discussions next week. And actually there's 2 projects going on that we could turn to. We'll take a detailed look at what they're proposing. You see how that fits with what we've been hearing back. So it's a thing that science needs to address multiple scales, time scales and spatial scales. And I think that coming up with the rules for individual restoration projects is going to perhaps be a lot more tangible. There's a lot more experience on producing that.
I think you ought to give consideration to the existing decision-making process on water operations of the federal and state water projects as a possible focal point for a new operational management which deals with water reliability and ecosystem issues. I'm not wedded to the idea of it being there, but that is, to my knowledge, what exists is the only long-term federal and state water management operation approach that we've got. And it's existed for a while, not without criticism, to be sure, but it may be that the science needs to look at something like that as opposed to look at the structural problem of decision making as opposed to what decisions should be made. I'm not positive about that, Peter, but it just seems to me that we can't simply get a science plan that further explains and elaborates ecosystem and then say, well, we don't, it's really hard on water management. We'll get around to that sometime, because we do have, from a public policy viewpoint, the statutory co-equal goals. Yeah.
Noted.
How you will incorporate your town hall survey responses and also your consultation with other agencies in your next draft. How you will do that. You want to comment on that now?
I think it's been relatively informal. Certainly we have all of the responses to the surveys together. And really that was soliciting ideas and similarly understanding where individual agencies are going with their science and where we fit in is extremely valuable. So I think what we're going to be doing is absorbing all of that over the next month and then coming up with some ideas about how all of these things could be connected. And it's complicated.
It's a good job.
Okay.
Thanks, Peter.
Other questions? Okay. All right. Mr. Knopp, my suggestion is we break a little early for lunch. We have the panel starting at 2 o'clock. If members got here 5 minutes before 2, would the staff be ready to talk to us about the date of the new meeting for comments that a subcommittee could hear so we could all check calendars and try to work it out?
I believe we could.
Okay, at 1:55 p.m., the council will meet for only 5 minutes to talk about the scheduling of that meeting and who's available to come. And then at 2 o'clock, we're going to start with the lower YOLO project discussion, which you'll find very interesting, I think. Hank, did you have a... Did you want to say something else? Okay, meeting's in recess, 1:55 p.m.
It's confusing to me to push a red button.